I think it's important for sellers to think about and realize that buyers that they were there at one time. They were in that buyer's shoes in many cases, when young, uncertain about what might come about, nervous, right? And to give that some sort of gives that some value. It's not just a transaction. These are people that are making both parties making huge decisions, and that they have to take each other's perspective into account. This is goodwill that they're buying and selling, and that's what that's about, right? Preserving the goodwill, so that what they're investing in or selling is kept whole. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, to add to that is that the seller needs the buyer to sell their practice and to have a fairness and an understanding that it's allowing them to exit. And if they can take that perspective of what this is like for the buyer, it gives a really, I think, balanced view of the whole process instead of what's in it for me only. But hey, you're helping me, I'm helping you, and we're getting this together. We can put this smooth transition.
It's also it's also often their legacy. Maybe 20, 30, 40. We've had sellers that have been at it for 50 years, right? And for them to be able to pass along their legacy to another dentist, to a buyer, they should understand that side of keeping a relationship whole, and that the buyer and the seller really, it is ideal for them to be able to gel and to start to create a relationship at some point, because that's what they're handing off to them, right? They want to preserve that and make sure it's in good hands and that everybody's happy about the process.
Looking at it globally, I think that buyers and sellers don't necessarily understand all of the moving parts that are required to bring this to fruition. There are banks asking for information. There's CPAs asking for information. There's consultants asking for information. There's lawyers asking for information. And to have an understanding that in order to get this done, we're going to need to work together, and there's a lot of moving parts. It takes time and patience.
Yeah. No, and I would only add, maybe going from the global view, the overall view, down to the kind of the more micro view, is that, sometimes I think it's surprising how difficult landlords can be. And we'll often get landlords involved early in the process just to try and make sure that we can untangle that best as possible. But I think that always surprises them, because it's maybe something that they have some understanding that it's going to be simple, and it should be, but it ends up being quite complex. One of the first things we do once we have a letter of intent between the buyer and the seller is to actually somehow engage the landlord or the property management people. It's either going to be that the buyer or the buyer's representative, usually a lawyer, is going to make contact with the landlord, or if the seller has a good relationship with their landlord or property management, we'll encourage them to pass along the news, kind of get the ball rolling a little bit, right? It can be one of the more complex parts of the process, and actually, unfortunately, can hold up the process for a surprising amount of time.
Yeah. And it's interesting. Anecdotally, we just had one that closed, and we had a closing date set, and everybody was preparing for that, and the landlord took an additional 4 months, which was an incredible exercise in patience for sure. And we got it done. It just took much longer than we had anticipated. Unfortunately, it all worked out. But and then also from a global point of view, every lease is different. Is the seller on a month-to-month? Did they just renew and they've got another 7 years? Is it just one more year left? Is it assignable? Is it going to be renegotiated? There's so many different moving parts in the way it could be structured, depending on what the seller has in place. Really, so it's not like a one size fits all, but you just kind of take it as it comes. We try to understand it very early in the process when we're engaging with our seller. We try to get a hold of their existing lease and all the amendments that go with it, so we understand what we're looking at, and then the buyer also and their legal can understand what they're looking at and how to move forward to get it done. It allows the buyer to know that this is a neutral third party that's putting a value on it. It's not biased. It's not the seller drawing a number. It's not their CPA drawing the number. It also lets the seller know this is not a pie in the sky number. Like, sometimes they need to be brought into reality because their $1 million practice didn't do $1 million in the last 3 years, and that this is the real number. Blue & Company are certified valuators that we work with, and they are independent. They are required by their legal qualifications to be neutral and to have certain guidelines that they follow in order to establish a price. So the buyer can be comfortable with it, the seller can be comfortable with it. Most of the time the banks are very comfortable with it because they know it can be trusted. And typically the buyer's CPA is also very comfortable with it because they too understand it's neutral and it's by guidelines.
Yeah. Yeah, the objective is to get to a fair market value, right? We're not looking for anybody to walk away from the table doing fist pumps because they won and somebody else lost. It should be a fair deal, a win-win situation. Blue & Company, they're experts at what they do. They do approximately 450 dental valuations a year, right? So they're probably one of the best in the country, if not. One of my favorite statements that one of the evaluator makes is that he's looking for that friction point between the buyer and the seller. So where the seller's not really happy and thrilled and the buyer's not really happy and thrilled. That means he found that perfect middle point where he knows he's in a fair zone of value for that practice. Trust throughout the entire process is really important. And that comes from a lot of different directions. Trust between the buyer and the seller, trust from the seller and the broker's perspective, back and forth, and trust with the advisors that are guiding the process. Luckily, because we encourage both buyer and seller to surround themselves with professional advisors, they can relax a little bit and know that there are other people taking care and watching out for them on areas that might get a little bit trickier or worrisome, which then allows maybe the trust to flow back and forth a little bit, right? From the emotion point of view, I think it's important for the buyer to put themselves in the shoes of the seller and understand that they've been at this for decades and they poured their heart and soul into something, and that they're getting ready to pass that along to somebody else, right? They're getting ready to let go of that. It's probably like it's their baby, right? It's what they've created with their work and their toil, if you will. And I think there's a lot of emotion that goes into that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think just to add to it also is that we work to be the conduit sometimes between the buyer and seller as we're working through this deal. We work with the advisor for the buyer. We work for the advisor of the seller. If there's any pieces that perhaps the lawyers are quibbling over, we try to step in and say, buyer, what is your true objective? Seller, what is your true objective? Can we find a middle ground? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, they're buying goodwill, they're selling goodwill, and we don't want that goodwill damaged. So to try to keep emotion down, be the mouthpiece for our client, and vice versa with the buyer. I mean, we try to have good relationships with the buyer so that we can bring this together in a very smooth and happy at the end process, because we all know when we're not being understood, sometimes emotions rise and they can be escalated if you're not being heard and understood and validated.
Yeah. One other thing that surprises me sometimes is that as sellers move into the process initially, they tend to look at it from a transactional point of view. And as they start the process, the reality of what they're getting ready to do and what they're ready to pass along to somebody else hits them. And it becomes quite emotional because it's no longer just a transaction. It's a transition that is their baby being handed off to somebody else.
Their staff, their patient, their livelihood, their legacy. It's a big deal.
I think from a large picture, it's the way we're approaching the process in general. Right? We represent the seller. That's who our client is. But we're very invested in making sure that the buyers they have the right perspective, right? That they understand the process, keeping the channels of communication open so that we can make the process as smooth as possible and get it across the finish line ultimately. We have some mechanical things that are different or operational pieces that are different. Our website is enormously robust. It allows buyers to build a profile. And in that profile, designate the areas that they're interested in geographically so that when a new practice is listed that actually fits within their parameters, they get an immediate email alert. Right? If they're just going to the website to look at it, they can search by state, by area within a state, whether the practice has property or doesn't have property associated with it, by specialty, by number of operatories, by collections. It's a very, very robust and strong website that allows buyers to find the practices that we're representing and listing.
I think another thing to add to it is we spend Todd because he's the one doing the buyer interviews as they're inquiring about a practice. He spends time talking about the practice that they're interested in, but he also spends time educating them. We feel it's really important. I don't know that buyers always get the business savvy, the education that they need to be successful in this. And so we have a buyer's guide that we provide them with checklists of what to expect as they're moving through this. That also has advisors that they can interview and decide what's a good fit, lawyers, CPAs, banks. So in our area, so these people are dental specific. If they have questions just, about a process throughout the buying, he's educating them. I feel like we take the time to listen and understand and communicate and create, again, that trust.
Yeah. Another piece is that we've developed a tool with Dental Intelligence, who is a national metrics company, helps practices understand the metrics, the numbers and the statistics of their practice from a reporting perspective. And we developed a proprietary report that actually shows all the opportunity in that practice so that we can actually hand a tool or hand a guide to a buyer that gives them the information of where, if they want to concentrate, they can increase the practice's collections. So it's actually, it's one thing for us to say to a buyer, hey, there's tons of opportunity here. Mm-hmm. It's another thing to hand them a report from a neutral party that spells it out crystal clear as to where that opportunity is.